Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here in this famous institution. So many important things have happened here. You must have felt the mystical atmosphere while you were approaching the building, because we talk about mysticism. We talk not only about that. I wanted to give it another title originally. So you see, this is what we have now. If you show the next one, I want to talk about ecstasis, but I thought maybe that title is a bit doesn't sound that good. So I will talk about ecstasis, but it is embedded in a larger context. It's my book where I compare three kinds of emptiness, and I think it's good that I talk first a little bit about the book. So if you are interested in it, you can. I have a web page where I present it. It's called Three Times Emptiness, Sunyata, Kenosis, Fana. There is this presentation which is not too long, and if anybody's interested. I want to establish this context. It's always good not only to say something, but also to say why one is saying it, how it is related to a larger project. I talk about emptiness in three different contexts. Sunyata, it's the emptiness in Buddhism. And then kenosis is a Christian concept, which means emptying. I will say a bit more about that afterwards. But anyway, this kenosis sunyata comparison has been done. It was very popular in the 80s. Here in Japan, there were lots of writings about it. Lasted about 15 years, and I was working on that in the past. And then I had the idea to add the fana to it. It's fana. It's not just fana. The Arabs don't understand what I'm talking about if I say just fana. It's fana'a. That seemed original to me. The Kyoto school, for example, which has written so much about emptiness, they compared Sunyata with European mysticism, Catholic, Eastern Protestant, but some other traditions have never been addressed, like Southern European, Catholic, Eastern European, Orthodox, and then also Islamic mysticism was, they were not very familiar with this. I always insist that what I'm doing is not comparative religion, but comparative philosophy. Because how can you compare religions? They are much too big. How do you want to compare Christianity with Buddhism? I mean, Buddhism, what is it? As soon as you say something, somebody can say, no, but it's not true for all Buddhism. So I compare certain philosophers, certain things that philosophers said with other things. And of course, they come from different traditions. But in the end, one does not compare the tradition, one does not compare the backgrounds. They come from different backgrounds, and one has to consider the background is important, but one compares ideas, concepts from philosophers and not the backgrounds. I want to go through a little bit this sunyata, that maybe best. It is the emptiness, the wu, in Chinese wu, that we have. The wuzhou, impermanence is related to it. So all that is related to sunyata. I had some other concepts. It's on the slide, but we can just skip it. And then I talk about kenosis. which is this in Christianity, the self-emptying, the self-annihilation of Christ. But what one should do, one should become empty, is the annihilation of the self, which is a common theme in Christian thought. And what is so particular, and this is what the Japanese philosophers found so fascinating, that here it is not only the emptying of the self of the believer, but the emptying of the major figure of Christ, that God himself became human, so that Christ himself was emptied. So that is very unusual, and it was suitable for a comparison of sunyata with kenosis. And now to add fana to this comparison is a bit tricky. One can say emptiness and one can go to a certain point, but then what interested me most is there also maybe in Islam this idea that God should be emptied, that it is not just a matter of emptiness and fullness. The subject empties himself and then comes God and fills the subject again. But like it is the case for sunyata, when we have real emptiness, it is so empty that the distinction between emptiness and fullness no longer exists. Now, is there something like that in Islam that has interested me? But anyway, as I said, here I want to talk now about kenosis, the other one. There is a video also on this that you can watch, where I talk about kenosis, Islam, sunyata. But here I wanted to pick a certain topic, the ekstasis. Now, a few words about this fana. It is the extinction of the self in the universal being. So it is the passing away of the self. The fana breaks down the individual ego, and it leads to an awareness of an intrinsic unity between God and all that exists. That includes the mind of the individual. So it's something that is not, there's only one mention of it in the Quran, just like kenosis is mentioned only 5 times in the Bible. And the whole discourse on kenosis, it's a little bit surprising that it became so important. And with fana even more, it's mentioned only once. And it has been cultivated by Sufism. Sufism emerged in the 9th century. It's a mystical branch of Islam. Just to make this clear, sometimes people think a Sufi is somebody who belongs to a Sufi order, but it's like mystics. Sufi is the only word that exists in Arabic to say mysticism. There is no other word for it. If you want to say somebody is a mystic, you have to say Sufi in Arabic, in Persian, in Turkish. So the person might not belong to a certain order, to a Sufi order, but one can be more or less a Sufi, exactly like in mysticism. It has developed in this tradition, and that is the background. This is why I talk about it. And I believe that ecstasis, this state of mind, this mental state that is achieved in mysticism, is related to emptiness. This is what I found, and I want to explain this here, that the ecstasis, the standing outside oneself, can only be achieved when one is empty. It cannot be achieved when one is full. So this emptiness, and this, maybe I can also relate it a little bit to the contemporary world, because we have people maybe they are not so much versed in philosophy or religion, but why would emptiness be interesting in any way today? Well, I think we are all full of information, of things that we should consume, that we should buy. Achieving an emptiness means that one sees the world in another way by throwing away all the things that one is told to fill oneself with. And this can also concern religion. And I think that was the idea that these philosophers had, that one can also be full of certain religious concepts, certain religious ideas, and that they also need to be eliminated. One has to be completely empty to make this mystical experience or to have this ecstasis. So it is a contemporary topic somehow, I think. So I want to start with a sentence, a statement that by Byung-Chul Han, which I reread recently, and that is not in the book, and I thought at least I can maybe mention it here because it's quite related. You know Byung-Chul Han, this Korean philosopher who writes only in German. So in his book, which is called The Burnout Society, so it's all about the burnout society. And he says, the exhausted, depressive achievement subject grinds itself down. It's tired, exhausted by itself, in war with itself, entirely incapable of stepping outward, of standing outside itself, of relying on the other, on the world. It locks its jaws on itself. So standing outside itself, we are like hamsters. You see, the hamster's problem is that his self is in the wheel. He thinks that this is himself, and he will stay in that wheel forever. He cannot stop. If he wants to stop, he would really have to stand, to get outside the wheel, to stand outside this self that he thinks, which is his self. That would be the ecstasis of the hamster. It's good that you came today. Nobody else will tell you about the ecstasis of the hamster, but I think it's a good image. That's what ecstasis is good for. There is an idea by Zahner, I don't know if you know him, from the 60s. He's no longer quoted, a specialist of Hinduism, but who also wrote on Sufism, who coined this word ecstasy, so the contrary of ecstasy. He calls that introverted narcissism. So when you are caught in yourself, then you have ecstasy, and ecstasy means to step out of yourself and to stand beside yourself. That is the meaning of ecstasy. So he talks about Hinduism, whatever, the Bhagavad Gita. There is on the Christian side, there's Yves Raguin, probably you know him, Jesuit who lived in Taiwan. He makes a similar point. He says the state of being dispossessed of the self as an exalted state of kenotic servitude is useful, and he finds that paradoxically this empty or this kenotic attitude leads to fullness in the sense of openness. When we are empty, then we listen, we are receptive, or maybe we contemplate while we are watching the world. So kenosis leads to a more spiritual fullness in the sense of non-narcissistic openness. So I can quote Yves Raguin, kenosis is the gateway to mutual understanding, and beyond this, to an intimate sharing that is the consummation of a relationship in union by dispossession of the self, we are able to absorb the amazing riches of others, the persons in themselves, as embodying a cultural tradition. So you see, it's all related, this sunyata, kenosis, and then I also think fana, because it overcomes self-centeredness. Self-centeredness in religion, you can have it not only for people, when they are so much in their religion that they can no longer see anything outside it. It can be for whole peoples, for groups of people. For example, one religion thinks that they are the chosen people. Well, this is narcissism. It's the same kind of self-centeredness. A little bit about the chronology, what I'm talking about, that you see, because maybe you know not much about Sufism. When I compare these things, I compare different philosophers, as I said already. A Zen master, the Roshi in Japanese, it would be in Arabic the Murshid. It means the same thing. It's the teacher, the guide, and it's used in Sufi orders. Now, most of these masters that I'm talking about here are medieval. They're all 8th, 9th century. Well, just you can skip that. I skipped that. Yeah, well, they come later then. Yeah, okay. On the Buddhist side, there's Nagarjuna, but that's old. That's a long time ago. But we have Limji. That's 9th century. There is Yunmen Wenyan. There is Joshu Jushin. There's Huineng. So they all lived in the 8th and 9th century, and that really, there must be reasons for that, but I'm not a historian of religion. Maybe there are no reasons. But that coincides with the medieval Sufis from the Islamic Golden Age, first phase. There are these people that we have now here on the slide. You see these names: Bastami, Mushabi, Kharas, Junaid, Hujwiri, Al-Halash, Shibli. They all lived at the same time. That is the earlier period of classical Sufism. And then Arabic real Islamic philosophy starts with Al-Kindi. Is in the 9th century. That he would be a direct contemporary of Kukai, just to show you a rough picture. And then there is the next group, the later ones, the Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, a little bit earlier, Al-Kushairi. That is the later period of classical Sufism, that is 10th to 16th, or the first three that I named is actually 13th to 16th. So that brings us in Japan to the Kamakura period. I think you can finish the slides now. There is no slide. There comes later maybe a slide, the kanji. So that brings us to the Kamakura period. We have Dogen, we have the Pure Land school, we have Basui. I would like to add Ikkyu, actually, eccentric, a little bit like Sufis. And then there are on the Christian side mystics like Meister Eckhart, Silesius, Saint Gregory the Great, Simeon the theologian. They all lived also in the Middle Ages or almost. So I mentioned them too. So then I work very much with the Kyoto school. I have to say that because maybe some people want to criticize it, or they want to, they wouldn't agree. But because the Kyoto school has so much worked on this, on sunyata, I take this angle plus Izutsu Toshihiko, without whom I would probably not have started this whole research. That was actually the starting point. So, of course, it's all limited. We never talk about all Buddhism. The Kyoto school is mainly Rinzai Soto, it's Dogen, reinterpretation of certain Chinese teachings. It's Pure Land Buddhism sometimes. So I approach from that angle. And of course, there's a lot of other things going on in Buddhism. Theravada has not that much interest in sunyata. They are more into ethics. The Dharma is not sunyata; is more the Dharma, is the law, the ho in Japanese. I pick certain things and try to make a certain statement. That's how philosophy is working. So the whole project, I also gave it the title officially here, this lecture, Comparative Mysticism. And that might be a bit problematic because first we have to say, what is mysticism? And then is there mysticism in all these religions? And that is, of course, a big question. Mysticism aims at the unification with God. So normally it can only be carried out properly when one talks about theistic religions. But I apply it to non-theistic religions too, and I try to explain very precisely why by concentrating on other topics. And one of them is ecstasis, another one is contemplation, another one is quietism. So I think there is a relationship between various mystical attitudes. Mysticism has often been related to an altered state of consciousness, and certainly there is a parallel between the Abrahamic religions and Dharmic practices. I call it Dharmic from Dharma. Everything you see, well, I always oppose Abrahamic to Dharmic. So strictly speaking, in Buddhism, there is no ecstasy in the real sense of the term, but the contemplation, the meditation, maybe it goes down similar paths similar to those of ecstasy-based mysticism, just because that meditation, that contemplation also is not supposed to be subjective. Now, if it's not subjective, what is it? It is ecstatic. Often one thinks that, has been said that Satori is a kind of mystical experience that is subjective, but that's precisely what it is not. It is not a feeling, it is not a psychological state, it is not a subjective experience. It just tries to go beyond this. Many things have been said, sometimes long time ago, by people who are not quoted very much, but like Guénon, René Guénon, I don't know if you know him, or in studies, specialists of Islam. But I found it interesting, I found it fascinating how people can say completely contradicting things about mysticism, which would exist in Buddhism, which would not exist in Islam, which can exist only in Islam, but not in Buddhism. People had very different opinions. It's quite interesting. One problem is that, of course, mysticism the word mystic comes from Greek. It comes from the European language, and it's connected to the mystery cults. And in Islamic theology, we don't have that. This is why they have the word Sufi. Guénon said that there is no Arabic word that can translate mysticism, and he thinks that mysticism is completely foreign to the Islamic tradition. So you see, I wanted to say that the mysticism in Arabic, in Sufism, which normally everybody agrees there is, that it does exist in Buddhism, and I want to make this case, but he puts it the other way around. He says, yes, it exists in Buddhism, but it does not exist in Sufism. So There are so many different ways of seeing it. By the way, he doesn't say why it would not be in the Islamic tradition. No? Yes, sometimes Sufism has been characterized as non-mystical, typically non-mystical. Then they have used the label of quietism, which would be incompatible with mysticism. Now, what does that mean, quietism? Nicholson says it's something what we would call in India, you would call that more ascetics and not mystics. It is this extreme passivity, whereas mysticism leads to ecstasis, which is not an activism, that would be wrong, but there's much more activity involved, whereas they found that in the Dharmic religions and then also in well, they excluded some of them, excluded the Dharma, but they found that in Sufism it all goes towards quietism. You just become very quiet, and then next comes pantheism, because then you somehow unite yourself with something. You are overpowered by the revelation of God, so you become a passive instrument. Now, it's not that simple. In Sufism, it's not that simple. In Buddhism, it depends on what you read. Then Buddhism and Taoism have also been classified as quietism. You think of the Wu Wei in Taoism, do nothing, do something by doing nothing. Well, what can be more non-doing quietism, and that would be completely incompatible with mysticism. That's what some people found. So the major problem is that this quietism appears to be incompatible with ecstasis, which is so important for mysticism. And people found that Buddhism and Islam are poles apart. What Christianity doesn't talk much about ecstasis in the Bible. There is something in Luke. Ecstasis gripped them all, and they began to glorify God. It is commonly often not translated as ecstasis, but as what actually happened as astonishment. But still, they talk about witnessing miracles. So maybe there is something like ecstasis in there. So it is true that meditation and contemplation that are common in Buddhism, they do not provoke an ecstasis as it is understood in the Christian traditions or in Neoplatism. They lead maybe to a sort of quietude. And one could conclude that Buddhism has nothing mystical in it. I found this interesting. Gershom Scholem, he says something very similar with regard to Judaism, which I don't really understand why he's saying this, but he thinks that Judaism has never had a mystical tradition because the ecstatic union with God is not possible. I say later a few sentences about that. It's very interesting. So same thing that has been said about Buddhism, Hinduism, that there would be no ecstatic union. So what does Nishida say? For Nishida, mysticism is often a negative word. He writes in his last essay that it's a pastime of a person of leisure. It's a bit, the mystic is somebody, well, who is too lazy to do something real. And so he becomes very quiet. But in the same essay, just 6 pages earlier, he says that Western philosophy, since Plotinus called mysticism, comes quite close to Zen. Well, he says different things here. But I think most important is what Nishida misses in mysticism is this standpoint of of objective logic that we have in Zen philosophy, according to him. He sees Zen as a provocation. He says it's a radical positivism. There is no transcendence. So there cannot be any mysticism, because mysticism would mean that you transcend yourself and you unite yourself with God. All that doesn't exist in Zen. Now, it's a bit misleading that he opposes mysticism here to science. In reality, I think he's not as anti-mystical as it appears here. This scientific attitude, I think it's very comparable to what later Islamic philosophers did, like Muhammad Abduh, when they wanted to reunite Islam with reason, not in the Salafist way, but saying that there is, one can employ reason in the religious experience, something like that. And then Nishida's pure experience, I think it is a kind of mystical, and he never says that it's irrational. So mysticism can conveniently be described as rational, and also as a religion of non-rational wisdom. And I think Nishida is on that point. He is working very much on that idea that Buddhist religious experience, there must be based on reality experiences. So they cannot be irrational, because then they will not be based on reality. Izutsu, he says something, he says about Zen Buddhism, he says at the original point of all philosophizing in any form whatsoever, there is and there must be a peculiar reality experience. What you want to experience in the end is not something unreal out there where you don't even know exactly what it is. That would be one kind of mysticism, but you want to know what reality is. So if we classify mysticism as an experience with something that is not real, then we would really say that mysticism is incompatible with Zen Buddhism. But there is, what matters perhaps more than all that, is the way in which reality is experienced. And I would say that this can be seen as mystical. In the end, there is an experience with reality, and it is reality, but the way in which it is experienced is mystical, and this has very much to do with ecstasis. If we use mysticism in this broader fashion to refer to a religious culture that is based on experience and inspiration, as opposed to more dogmatic religions that are working around rules, then I think we see real parallels. Let's talk about contemplation and the self, the transcendence of the self. It is, of course, absurd to assume that mysticism is the property of Christianity and Islam. It's true that Buddhism never developed a real mysticism in the proper sense, but it permits incursions of the divine into human consciousness. I define the divine broadly, like the Kyoto School does. So it's true that there is no mystical union with God in Buddhism, but there is the idea of the transmutation of the human consciousness into something that can be called divine. You can call it absolute, you can call it perfect goodness, eternal wisdom, but it is a reality that they want to experience, and then they become mystics. Scholem, I come back to him because he says that in Judaism, he says there is no mysticism? Well, we understand why, because there is no ecstatic union with God, because God and the human must always be separate. And apparently, I don't know much about it, it's impossible in Judaism to say that there is a union with God. That's what he says. But he says there was ecstasy. So maybe there was mysticism still. It's just that there is always this consciousness of God's otherness that remains. So that is perhaps not typical, but it's interesting that he sees it like that. So you have seen there are so many controversies about the existence of mysticism. How is that possible? It's very strange that people say so many different things. One says there's mysticism here, but not there. The other one says, no, it's just because it's there, it is not there. I think the key word is ekstasis. It means in Greek standing beside oneself, and meditation and contemplation lead to mental states that sometimes very literally evoke this expression. In Buddhist tradition, it's brought about through reflection, contemplation. That is not alien to Christian mysticism or to Sufism either. I think this comparison can be conducted. Of course, contemplation does not lead to ecstatic raptures, but it leads to a state, the contemplation can lead to a state of standing beside oneself. Nishitani, he develops a concept of the ego that stands beside itself, when he says that no ego should be grounded only on itself. Think of a hamster, because that would be self-centeredness. He sees the Zen Buddhist ego as a non-ego or as an ecstatic ego, and he uses the word, the original self within the ego, as the home ground of the ego is at bottom ecstatic. So he calls this the ecstatic awareness of Dasein, which means that the finitude of Dasein is transcended. Now, maybe it's still not transcendence, transcendent immanence come together. That is a different topic. But in any way, we see there is ecstasis in Buddhism. So there might not be this rapture, but there is definitely a transcendence of the self, of seeing the world not through the usual self, but through non-discrimination. And that is only possible when you detach yourself from yourself. And then again, it doesn't mean that these mental states are beyond intellectual control, that the mystic is now plunged into an eternal night of non-discrimination. It is not, there are so many different concepts of nirvana, like of sunyata, but most of them would say that one also needs to get, one comes back to reality, or one sees reality. So it's that suddenly everything is blurred and you see the world in a blurred way. That is not the idea of this standing beside yourself. You have a clearer vision of reality. I have a little bit more here. So a koan is not mystical. A koan, it aims to push us to see reality without mystery, without concealment, because here the absolute is supposed to be grasped immediately and spontaneously as a simple reality and just not as a mystery. This is what Nishida means when he says that Zen is not mysticism. Masao Abe, he confirmed, he says Buddhism is radical realism. What Nishida writes in the essay from which I quoted already, the mystification of the absolute should rather be seen as the result of Western logic that divides the world into the objective and the subjective. So the ultimate ground of reality, since it is not an objective reality, can only be grasped as something that is subjective. That means mystical. This is my sense, it's not Nishida. So it is Western logic that talks about an objective reality and a subjective reality. So if you think that there is something that is not empirical, that is not objective, well, what can it be then? Well, then it must be subjective. That is the simple vision of mysticism, but that is to apply that to Buddhism, it would be a misconception. And I think it is a misconception for these other mysticisms that I try to tickle out of the Islamic tradition and also the Christian tradition. Because that distinction between subject and object is just the thing that is supposed to be overcome. So when the Zen Buddhist says the flower blooms just as it blooms, or when he says mountains are mountains, that is not nature mysticism. Ueda Shizoteru has written about that. Abe says that Zen and natural mysticism or pantheism should not be confused, because the latter, the pantheism, lacks a clear realization of the negation of subject and object. You have the nature and you think there is God in nature and you let that go into the subject. Precisely when you say mountains are mountains, then you do something else. You are not doing that. So this is not pantheism in the Western sense, because it does not imply a transfer of mystical truth from object, from the nature to the subject. If they would do that, people who do that, very much they work with symbolisms, but Zen never works with symbolisms. All these things, as Isuzu makes it also very clear, that the rocks, the birds, they are not symbols for something beyond. They are so many concretely real things. Why would Zen then still be called mysticism? Because I think it can. Well, it's only because it relates to a certain form of awareness that the Zen experience is supposed to produce. We can say that it leads to a self-awareness of the reality of the mountain. Now, what does that mean? Nishitani writes, by the self-awareness of reality, I mean both our becoming aware of reality and at the same time, the reality realizing itself in our awareness. So it means we become aware of reality through an awareness of ourselves. And we become aware of ourselves through an awareness of reality. Abe makes this more radical when he says that the realized is the realizer and the realizer is the realized. So realization is expressed through a proposition that concerns the unattainable, in which then the true self, so the self that has to stand outside itself, is grasped in terms of attribute as a predicate, as Abe also says somewhere. So it is related to to this negation of subject and object. Certainly, this awareness comes close to a standing beside oneself, like in ecstasis. Uno Taisetsu says that when I see a beautiful sunset, I become aware not only of nature's grandeur, but something happens within me. The sense of real overcomes me. But at the same time, the sunset realizes itself in my awareness. It becomes real, which was not the case when I was preoccupied with my own thoughts, when I was in the wheel like a hamster. What comes in here is also, one has to emphasize this, the topic of unity, which is so important in other religious traditions too, the oneness, the tawhid in Islam. the nature of reality is fragmented, but this fragmentation will be washed away, because now there is no division between the objective and the subjective, because that is what created the fragmentations. So then we have the state of oneness, and not because we made ourselves empty and then God comes into us and there is only one, which is another version of emptiness. And we have this very much in Islam with Fana Baka, but I try to find something else. Some mystics saw it more in the way in which I described it here in Zen Buddhism, but I cannot come to this today. So this particular awareness is due to a kenotic movement that lets reality, theists would say God's reality, be part of the self. But it does not mean that the self disappears, that it has been replaced with this divine reality. It's rather that the self is no longer a subjective self as opposed to an objective self. One more example by Uno. He says, when I hear the delicate penetrating sound of a bamboo flute played by a master, I'm taken to another level of reality that transforms my whole being. But at the same time, the sound realizes itself in my awareness. It becomes truly real. So we wouldn't expect here a link with Baka, which I mentioned, with this fullness that Islam wants to, the abiding that Islam wants to have, the abiding of God. But there actually is something like that, because the thing, the koto, speaks out of its selfness, as he said. Why? Not for the sake of the person who listens to it, but out of its own fullness. And the human can listen to that fullness. But of course, and here, this is a sentence by him, by Uno, you must leave your subjective preoccupation with yourself. We have heard this already several times now. You have to step outside yourself and stand next to yourself. So everything is about awareness, but there is no subjective preoccupation with the self or with the self's awareness, which is paradoxical. But this is why, the only reason why it can grasp this simultaneous emptying and filling that so many religions have been struggling with. Uno speaks of the fullness, not of the self, but of the bamboo, as I said. And then Abe says that emptiness, the sunyata, is identical with wondrous being or fullness. So empty and full, but emptiness and fullness become the same thing then. So it is this fullness, and it's not the fullness of God that is experienced. So this experience, it is religious, though it is not explicitly related to God, but I think it can be called mystical. Koan aims at the unmasking of a reality that is not real. So we perceive a no mind, which it identifies emptiness with fullness. Islam has said similar things. So I could stop here. Yeah, okay. So I'll leave it here and maybe we have a discussion. Thank you very much.
This is very interesting, and I think the idea of approaching the dialectic between being and nothingness, or being and emptiness, by way of ecstasis, I think that's a very good idea. But I wonder if there isn't a shift going on, kind of a problem in a different model behind the being and nothingness dialectic in Western mysticism and Eastern mysticism. I use those terms loosely. So we have being, which is opposed to nothingness or emptiness. And in the Western philosophical tradition, the primary analog is being. Therefore, the goal of being, or human existence as a form of being, is the fullness of being. Getting rid of nothingness. But in the Eastern tradition, the goal of emptiness is to empty emptiness. That sounds a little esoteric, but let me make it much clearer. So ecstasis in the Western tradition has kind of two stages, I think, a basic stage and then a radicalization of that stage. The basic stage is standing outside of oneself, achieving unity with God, so that the individual becomes one with God without losing their individuality. But the radicalization of that we see in people like Eckhart and Ariugina is nothingness, the complete loss of self and selfhood and godhood and nothingness. So emptiness becomes a kind of radicalization of the fullness of being. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, the goal is withdrawal. Withdrawal from self, withdrawal from the world. That's the most radical form of ecstasy. Whereas in the traditions we find in Zen and Buddhism, and to some extent in Taoism as well, the goal is very different. The immediate goal is nirvana, enlightenment, awakening. That's the first type of ecstasis. But the second radicalization of that ecstasis is return to the world. It's nirvana in samsara. So the goal is not withdrawal, but it's a kind of re-entry. So if you see, the primary analog in the West would be being and nothingness. But the primary analog in these Eastern traditions, I think, is emptiness and non-emptiness.
Mm.
And the non-emptiness means the radicalization of emptiness means returning to the actual world of illusion and so forth. Whereas the radicalization of the world where being is primary is complete absorption, loss, withdrawal from the world and from selfhood and even from God. So there are overlaps in the idea of ecstasy, I think, in the two of them. But when you look at the way ecstasy is radicalized or the way the experience is deepened, I think they go in different directions.
Yeah, my idea was to say that even in the Western tradition, they try to retrieve this thing that is getting lost. Because already the self survives. I mean, now I talk about Islam because it's a very big problem. If you empty yourself, now if there is no self, what can God go into? So the self must survive. So it's never a complete withdrawal. This is the critique of quietism, and many people have seen the Eastern. Now you actually want to see it the other way around. That in the Eastern tradition there is a going back to the world. I think it's only for some. Zen Buddhism says that Hisamatsu has very much insisted on that if you just meditate for the sake of meditation, that's useless. You have to do something. You have to go back to the world. And then one has the impression that some Christian monks or Sufis, they live only for prayer, and they pray the whole day and they do nothing else. Or you would say no, there is the other around. I mean, that already shows how complicated it is. I think all religions, you have both. There are always people who say this is enough, and the closer you are to God, just shut yourself in, and the world is bad. We stay with God. And there have also been people who said no, but that cannot be all. There must be something else. We must also go back. And you have that in all religions, probably. I see it in Sufism as much as in Buddhism. And then you have the exact contrary too. And so I wouldn't polarize and say that they are doing this and they are doing this. It depends on what you concentrate on.
My concern is that there's ordinary ecstasy and there's mysticism in everyday life, there's mysticism, ordinary religious experience. But there's also the certain percentage of mystics that become really radical, take them right down to the bottom. These mystical giants, I mentioned Eckhart and their aging. But that's all, and they end up in nothingness, in emptiness. So it's not that other side's disappeared, it's been radicalized, it's been transcended. And in the East, the most transcendent people are the people that return to the world. The nirvana samsara. That's the way that the Judaism ends, right? The return to the world. That's the most radical form, I think. And I think the radicalization, the goal of radicalization is different. One is withdrawal, and the other one is re-entry. And I don't say everybody goes there. There are very, very few mystics. People may have flashes of mysticism, but will really live it out. I think there are very few. But ecstasy is an ordinary experience. Yes, I think that's the word. I find that really interesting. Sure. Sorry.
Can we say just an addition to what Jim was saying? Can we say that they may be different, but like there's no like opposition? Like since that you're talking about you talk about these overlaps, and so I was thinking that maybe when Jim was explaining the differences between Western and Eastern mysticism, he was talking about different directions. So I was thinking about maybe there's a different idea of temporality that we can put in these two different contexts. Like, since that Jim was talking about a return to the world, like, I was seeing this as a sort of circle rather than, having a much more, well, speaking about return, right? That you go, there's a peak and then, you're going back to where you were before. Like, I was imagining something, I was trying to visualize possible movement here. On the contrary, if we focus our attention on Western mysticism, maybe, I don't know, speaking about possible visualization, I would say that maybe it's much more, maybe like a straightforward trajectory, or like an arrow could be, I don't know, I was thinking about something like a line, a movement that goes from a larger area to a very specific point in time in which you're trying to pierce that point, to go behind that point. I don't know, I was thinking about temporality as a possible term that can help to contextualize temporality, like, a different idea of time that we can, I don't know, we can rely on when we want to visualize these differences in a possible way. I was thinking about that simply because, she mentioned the word return, and then I was thinking about this withdrawal from oneself, like, that reaching a threshold where there's something that you are unable to describe at some point after that. So maybe like a trajectory, like a straightforward line, or like an arrow could be a good image for that. That it was, as I said, it was just a comment that Jim's questions made me think of. So I was thinking that I don't know if in your book you discussed, you expand your discussion or your analysis on temporality.
One could say, but it would lead us somewhere else. Maybe the temporality. I'll ring some bell, but I think we shouldn't go into that.
Okay, no, because maybe I'll someone, a mystical person feel, and his or her their relationship with time when they experience something, when they trying to think of in retrospect of their experience. There's definitely time in this, like, you know, the way you think of yourself, the act of thinking, going behind your own thinking, time is definitely involved, because it is an experience that goes behind the very definition of experience, maybe, but there's definitely time. I mean, we need to include this, because otherwise we're speaking about, you know, in a sort of a temporal dimension, but it's false, because we're living in temporality.
Yeah, well, there's this whole idea that it has its own time, but that maybe it's another topic that is more like a dream that develops its own time, and it doesn't take place in the real time, because again, then you could speak of periods, of timely periods, and this is just the thing that is supposed to be overcome in this experience. Something.
Thank you so much. There's lots of things I want to ask. Just one question. You said about the ecstatic ego, for example, you mentioned that case. So as long as I understand his concept is this ecstatic ego, that means for him, my ego has the ground of my ego is nihil. There's no such a substantial foundation. So no ground is the ground of myself. And as long as I understand Star's understanding of this ego, that means the ecstatic ego means separate from oneself, who think oneself as the center was already the substantial fundament. But you said something very important. The ecstatic ego comes out of oneself and stand next to oneself. So I understand exactly what you mean. So listening to that phrase, I imagine, I don't know, I have understand you correct, but for example, I see myself. So for example, I think I am playing on the stage and I stand next to myself. Then I see as audience, see what I am playing on the stage. If that is the what you understand as the ecstatic ego, isn't it another form of the attachment to oneself?
No, it should be overcome. I think there is this funny story that's from Sufism. Shibli, one of the crazy Sufists, he wanted to be alone with God. He wanted to be alone with God. Alone with God. But he wanted to be completely alone, so that even Shibli would not be there. As he wanted to be so alone with God that even he himself wouldn't be there. So you see, in the end, you cannot do that thing with logic. It's just an overcoming of logic. So if you still see yourself and standing beside yourself, then something is wrong. This is just a thing that should be avoided.
Maybe we can find some similarity. For example, when Nishitani says the I-thou relation Jainism. So
yeah, something like that.
It's not speak on my ground. In that sense, the Tao is what I can say. That the prior, my ground. And in that very sense, Tao is my ground, my foundation. So maybe it can be, I want to be alone with God. I don't know whether it can be similar between them, there's similarity, but I think I can imagine something similarities. So I want to be alone with God, or I want to be alone with my wife, or I want to be alone with my best friends.
Without yourself?
Yeah. That give us something to think about ourselves. Yeah. It's a concept, yeah. Thank you so much.
So people online, if you want to enter the discussion. Yes, someone?
Hello.
Ah, Joe, please.
Hi. Thorsten, thanks very much.
Oh,
I hope you will give me that text for the Japan Mission Journal. I disagree with one thing you said, that quietism is not mystical. At least I think quietism is absolutely mystical. So much so that I even talked about Buddhist quietism as an important idea. But surely Fénelon, the maxims of the saints, les maximes des saints, and Madame Guyon, she might have been historical and so on, but surely they belong to the world of mysticism.
I fully agree. I just presented that to show how many controversies there were, and this idea that quietism is not a mysticism that comes from Guénon, and then Nicholson, this 1915 scholar of Islam, he says the same thing about Islam, and then Guénon says
sorry, I
it.
didn't understand.
So I just want to show how complicated it is, and that people use the idea of quietism. I mean, quietism is not a very important word, I would say. One can live without that. But the only reason why I bring it up here is I want to show how people have been arguing mysticism, not mysticism. It's kind of confusing, but interesting. Yeah?
Who was that man you mentioned who had said quietism was not mysticism?
René Guénon.
Guénon, I see.
Yeah.
René Guénon, I see. Isn't he a kind of dubious source? He's a great influence on Steve Bannon.
You see, oh my God.
But along with Julius Evola, Evola, the Italian fellow, they're all very iffy people, I think.
Yeah, no, he is dubious. I mean, this whole group with Chouan and all these people. But still, I mean, sometimes there is an interesting sentence, there's an interesting reflection in there, so that I think one can look at it. And when one studies Sufism, I think one reads Guénon automatically. He's still kind of important, but of course,
I didn't realize that.
To be taken with a grain of salt and everything, kind of like Jung, a little bit drifting away sometimes, very often actually.
I see. What do you think of Izutsu?
Well, Izutsu is good. Things that he says, he writes on Taoism and Islam, but it's very useful. I like it. I think I read everything that I could find in languages that I can read.
I have to go and meet a mystical man now, Alexander O'Neill, co-editor of Buddhism and Neoplatonism. So I'll leave you and wish you luck.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Yeah.
Bye.
Other people want to put a question or make a comment?
I could just jump in quickly.
Yes.
Okay, my name is Logan. I'm joining you from Kyoto right now. It occurred to me that the back and forth about what is or isn't mystical partly might come from just modernity's turning it into a pejorative term, just some of the negativity associated with things that are mystical in modernity, that it might have sort of an unconscious influence there. And then I also wondered, the idea that mysticism is a union with something, or it's a union with something outside of yourself. That seems to me like very close to the idea of unio mystica, and maybe part of the issue is that that's very culture and religion specific. And I wonder if maybe it wouldn't help to think of mysticism more as direct experiencing. Because if you think of it as direct experiencing, then Satori is mysticism, Fana is obviously mysticism. You know, does it help maybe to broaden the definition a little bit? And that's
Yeah, well, I think I try to wrench it away from this negative definition of mysticism, just by saying it does not lead to something blurry. It does not make things unclear that were unclear to begin with, but somehow unites us with something that remains unclear. I think that is the bad definition of mysticism, and often it functions like that. But more like Nishida sees Zen Buddhism, it leads to clarity. And I think it is possible to see mysticism like that, because when there is the ecstasis, when there is the standing outside oneself, what's the purpose of it? The purpose is to leave behind the prejudices or the usual way of seeing, and then things become clearer and they do not become unclear. And you are not uniting yourself with something that you barely understand, because it is mystical, but it's rather, well, reality is seen in a non-mystical way, paradoxically. Yeah? But for that, you need some mystical devices. First, you need some trick. Yeah? I think the whole Zen Buddhism is, for me, it's a little bit like that. I mean, koan, what is it other than a trick? It's a trick that you trick your brain into something, and then you see the real thing. So I think mysticism can be seen in the same way, but most of the time it hasn't been seen like that.
so in other words, so whereas like modernity thought of mysticism as irrational, a new emerging way to think of it is that it's kind of clarifying, actually.
Yeah, like what Nishida says about Zen, that it's just logical and it's rational, and because there is this immediacy. Yeah? If anything is unclear in the world, it is because the subject cannot properly understand the object. Either because the object is unclear, or probably because the subject is not able to grasp it, because the subject has deficiencies. So if you eliminate the difference between subject and object, then you have solved that problem. But of course, that's the most difficult thing to do. For that, you need some tricks, but that's what they are trying to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks very much. And yeah.
Can I also
Yes.
come in with a remark which sort of builds on what Adam you've just said about mysticism and having a really bad reputation in some ways. I think it has to do with the idea that it's associated with irrationalism, and somehow your insistence, I think, as part of the presentation of the debates on mysticism, your insistence on being a mysticism being rational and based on reason, and Zen experience being based on reason, as Nishida said, might be part of the problem and part of the answer to the problem, because I think you also said, or probably implied more than said, that ecstasis, the experience of being beside oneself, implies overcoming logic, the sort of Western binary logic of subject versus object, this versus that, being able to think differently. So do you think it's to some extent not fair or incorrect to say that it is an experience based exclusively on rational thinking, on reason, or is this because perhaps the insistence on being an exclusively rational experience has to do with the possibility of communicating it? So whereas things that are perfectly, beyond binary logic, which we normally use to communicate things, remain inaccessible. So insisting that it is somehow within our grasp, within our rational grasp, is also linked to the possibility of communicating it.
Well, everything one can only say yes, but this is just the problem. You can always say he wants to overcome the rational logic, but this is a very logical project. The only reason why he wants to overcome reason is that with his reason he thought that this is the best thing to do. It always goes in a circle, and it's more, I see it more like a game. This whole mysticism. It is just when it is not seen as a game, then you have a problem, because then you think that it really leads somewhere, and then you have the negative kind of mysticism. But I think I hear, when I hear some people, especially take this Shibley, I mean, what does he mean? Is he serious? Is he serious about that? He wants to be alone with God without himself. He knows perfectly well that this doesn't make sense. But it's just a trick. It's just a game that is played, and it has some meaning. It leaves you somewhere. But if you take it literally, and you think that that is now an ideology, or that that is a rule, and you turn it into a dogma, and you will do exactly that, you end up at exactly the contrary what you wanted to have. So all these things, yeah, we probably cannot get rid of reason, just because, as Jim said, we are going in a circle, and we always come back to reason anyway. We cannot live without reason. But already the fact that we are aware of that problem, that is already something. It's a bit like Kant, that we are aware of our own subjectivity, that everything is just subject. And it cannot be changed, but at least we are aware that this is the case. So there is no answer to that, I think. But we can just analyze it up to a certain point, and that's all we can do.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. If you could send the link to your book again, I don't think I could get.
It's not a link to the book. I have a presentation where I presented. The book is not yet out.
Oh, it's not yet out. Oh, sorry. Okay.
But you can read some things maybe that you are interested in.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
You can give a look to Professor BOTZ homepage.
Yeah, there you find it. There is a picture of the cover, and you click on it, and you will find it quickly, I think.
When you mentioned Nishitani's criticism of mysticism, that was also shared by Tanabe, maybe much more strongly. And I think part of the reason is that the connotation of the Japanese term is very different from the connotation of the English term. The Japanese always means the secrets of divine secrets. It has to do with God. Whereas the Western suggests the mystery religions. It would be more like a Japanese mitsugi, or maybe even mikkyo. So experiential and unknown and difficult, and not but non-rational, irrational. But as soon as you talk about mysticism, then you're talking about these people who are talking about union with God, and that's not necessarily the case for us. But I think part of his rejection is simply a result of the connotations of words.
Maybe, yeah.
Thank you, Thorsten, once again for your wonderful talk.